Good evening. My colleagues and friends, it's both a source of great joy as well as honor to be part of this very important conversation. And at the beginning, I would like to thank Omega Institute, Peter, and also Michelle Becker for really coming up with this idea and bringing all of us together in this room starting from today. And this is a wonderful opportunity for many of us who have really worked individually in our own small corners, trying to develop a program that is adapted from contemplative practices and insights coming from psychology and Buddhist thought and practice, and really trying to bring it out into the larger world. And, since if you look at the history of the emergence of these practices, it's been just over a decade. So the timing of this particular conference seemed to be really, perfect. It's not too early and not too late, and it's really right at the cusp when this kind of conversation needs to happen, which also will foster a spirit of cooperation, collaboration, and mutual learning. So right at the beginning, I would really like to express my deep appreciation to Omega Institute for really hosting this, and to the members of all of the compassion training world for really accepting the invitation and coming together and willing to sit down and explore the idea of compassion education together. So many of us who are in this particular world are inspired by a simple idea of compassion and the belief that in compassion there's a real potential for bringing something that is beautiful in human nature. That is really the driving force, at least in my own case. I grew up as a Tibetan refugee child in India. From a very early age, I became a monk. And one of the things that I did in my early monastic life is memorize an entire text by Shantideva, which is, over 1,000 verses, actually, called, Bodhicharya Avatar. There's a beautiful Oxford English, World Series translations of that. And Shantideva's text, as a kid, of course, I did not. Once in a while, I'll know what the verses were saying, but large part of the text just went, above my head. But as I grew older, Shantideva's text began to speak to me. And this is a very beautiful text, which for the Tibetan tradition and for the Indian Buddhist world in the classical period was for us probably the most important inspirational and educational resource on the psychology and practice of compassion. So I cannot pretend that I had some kind of forethought at that young age, having some kind of, eureka moment and recognizing this is what is going to be an important part of my life. But looking back, I genuinely feel that there was something in the fact that as a child, I memorized this text. And of course, although I'm involved in this very universal, secularized protocol that has been developed at Stanford, in my own personal life, a large part of the inspiration and practice on compassion really comes from my own Buddhist monastic training. And one of the things, as I, left the monastic life and choose to live a modern life, which is not that dissimilar to the life that all of you lead, in the West, quite fast-paced, having to pay the bills, take care of your relationship with your, important person in your life, raise kids, and at the same time, not lose yourself in the nitty-gritty or everyday details, and being able to maintain some kind of big picture and optimism and hope for the world. And there, I've found the teaching on compassion to be a powerful source in my own courage, in my own inspiration, and in my own everyday optimism, to really function in this very complicated world. So when the opportunity came for me to play a more active role, of course, I was able to seize it. Another important influence in my life has been, the ability and opportunity and honor I had for a long time, over 30 years now, almost 33 years, serving His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Many of you who recognize my face and my voice will associate me with His Holiness. I remember, many, many years ago, I was somewhere in American City. I was changing plane in Detroit. And so I was talking, I bumped into a friend, so we were animatedly talking something, I don't exactly remember. A woman walked past and turned back, walked again and turned back and came up to me. And she said, I know you. And she was quite puzzled, and she started getting worried that why can't she place me, So she was, and I could see the look on her face. She was actually quite getting worried. So I said, well, maybe does the Dalai Lama sound right? She said, you are the interpreter. She was so relieved, quite happy. Without even saying thank you, she just walked away. So that has really been my, this is just a story, but for me personally, the fact that I had the opportunity to serve him so closely for so many decades, years, has really deepened my conviction in the power of compassion, and to really have the opportunity to see from, as it were, from a kind of a front seat, what it means to live your life from the place of compassion. How can, if you choose it, one can make compassion as a powerful guiding principle, an organizing principle, in fact, a philosophy of life. What difference does it make? And I've been really privileged to be able to have that opportunity. So now, today, we're living in a very complicated world, and more than ever, I think we need to spread the message of compassion. I would even use the word, the gospel of compassion. It's really a good news. The gospel of compassion really needs to be spread, because if you look around the world is not getting simpler. The world is getting more complicated. And one of the things that we learn from now, 2 decades of experience of globalization, is that globalization brings different people together, different perspectives together, different worldviews together, different values together, different cultures together, which exerts upon us a tremendous pressure to really find a way to understand and coexist. And we are now seeing that not just in the world, particularly in this country. We're seeing what kind of difficult consequences there would be if we are not able to somehow find a way to have a conversation that touches upon the commonality. If we isolate ourselves, if we, push ourselves into small cocoons of different echo chambers, what are the consequences in public life, in private life, in your relationship with others, and so on? So there is, in other words, a growing tribalism in the world, and one of the most powerful counterforce against this tribalism is to really promote the idea and philosophy of compassion, which calls upon recognition of the fundamental shared humanity. That, I think, is really an important point. The second thing is that we know, for example, one of the things that a lot of social scientists worry about today is really the growing epidemic of loneliness. And loneliness, some scholars dispute whether it is a real epidemic or not, but the fact is, if you look at the statistics, it's actually quite high. And also, some of the social scientists are beginning to worry the impact of social media, excessive exposure to social media, and its impact on greater sense of alienation from your fellow human beings, and the impact it might have on loneliness. Now, when it comes to dealing with loneliness, there's nothing more powerful than compassion. Because compassion forces you, compels you to get out of your narrow self and find a connection with a fellow human being. And this increasingly repeated studies on human well-being and happiness really points out one very important ingredient for happiness is social connectedness. Social connectedness means the sense that you care for someone or others and you feel loved by someone and others. So that is the heart of social connectedness. Social connectedness is a powerful antidote against loneliness. And what will give you that sense of connection? It's really the compassion. Compassion really, at the heart of compassion, is the connection with someone. That really is the heart and the foundation of compassion. So by being able to bring the message of compassion more broadly, more widely, not only does the individual learn to gain something, but also individuals' perspective on the world changes. So I think the message, the time has really come for compassion to really bring into the world. Another important thing about the compassion is that compassion offers one of the very few things that can bring the diverse world of religious and the secular together. Because compassion is not a value that can be exclusively claimed either by the religious perspective nor by the secular perspective. Because when it comes to compassion, all the religions, and including the humanistic perspectives, really come together. No one would dispute the importance of compassion. And if you look at many of the ethical teachings that are out there, whether it is religion-based or humanistic-based, at the foundation of all these ethical teachings is really compassion. Because if you distill the fundamental principle of ethics, it's the golden rule. And because the central question of ethics is how do I treat the person in front of me? That really is the central question of ethics. Ethics, those in the religious framework tend to confine ethics in terms of rules and precepts and so on. But fundamentally, the question of ethics is a question of how do you treat your fellow human being? And then the answer that is given in all the major religious traditions as well as humanistic tradition is just as how you would like to be treated by the other person. That is the expression of compassion principle because it ultimately calls into your attention the need to take into account the impact of your behavior upon someone else. So from all of these points of view, I think compassion is something that we really need to take a look at. And compassion also can bring the diverse perspectives, different cultures, religious and the secular, really together and offer us a common platform. Because when you look at many of the disputes, often disputes take place and remain unresolved so long as the two parties haven't found a common ground. So once the two parties find a common ground, then there is a basis to build up trust and all the other relations that comes after. But until in a dispute some kind of commonality is found and reached, the dispute goes on. Whether it is conflicting narratives, or whether it is two clashing cultures or civilizations, whatever it is, so long as you remain at this level of discord and is not able to get down to the bottom where there is some basic shared common reality, the conflict will remain. And compassion is one fundamental reality that can really offer us that foundation of commonality. So from all of this point of view, I think the time for compassion has really come. Now, one of the advantages of our time now is actually the culture, particularly the secular culture, is actually receptive to compassion. There was a time, not that long ago, where the scientific community was actually suspicious of compassion and altruism. The most kind of mainstream influential view of human nature was the ultimate explanation of human behavior must be based on some kind of pursuit of self-interest. There was a refusal to even acknowledge the reality of true altruism. There's an American psychologist who spent his career, Dr. Batson, Professor Batson, his career presenting series of experiments using college undergraduates to demonstrate experimentally there are genuine cases of altruism, which has nothing to do with the pursuit of self-interest. So there is a very famous or notorious statement by an American psychologist who basically said, scratch an altruist and see a hypocrite bleed. The point he was making was, anyone who gives, explanation that is really at the level of altruism hasn't really dug deep enough. If you want a true ultimate explanation of a human behavior, it has to involve some kind of pursuit of self-interest. So that was the intellectual culture. That was the dominant scientific view, which now has changed. When it comes to evolutionary biology, hardly anyone questions the reality of altruism. We even see this in the animal world. If we see this in the animal world, what's wrong with the human world? So biological altruism is now, these days, it's almost unquestioned. It's really accepted. Psychological altruism is what the technical term is. It's still a little debated because humans are complex creatures. We have many different sources of motivation, and sometimes our level of self-awareness isn't that great, so we may think we're acting out of pure an altruistic intention, but there might be an underlying motive. So humans are very complicated. So that's why there is still some debate about psychological altruism when it comes to human beings. But most psychologists and scientists today basically accept that altruism is real and compassion is part of human nature. And for this, I think one of the things that we really need to acknowledge is the role His Holiness has played. One of the, of course, the world recognizes his role for being the champion for peace, world peace, understanding, compassion, and so on. But one thing that is often not appreciated is the contribution he has made in normalizing the discourse on compassion, to really making it more universal, making it more real, making it more grounded in some basic understanding of human nature that is independent of any religious perspective, not even Buddhist perspective. And he has written, 2 books specifically for this. One is called The Ethics for the New Millennium, which is a case he made in the 90s about the need to develop and the possibility of developing a universal discourse on ethics that is independent of any religious or specific cultural perspective, which was then followed up by another book called Beyond Religion, where he took the argument further and presented specific practices as well. So I think his role in making compassion language much more natural and normalized has been a very important one. And of course, science, the emergence of new science of compassion is really an important player in this. Oxford University just recently released, last year, an Oxford Handbook on Compassion Science. And many of the contributors for that volume are in this room today. When Oxford University Press feels the need to produce a volume on compassion science, it is a suggestion that it has reached a level of maturity. The field has reached a level of maturity. One of the powerful effects of science being part of the dialogue is science has a way of naturalizing the language. And also science has a way of making the discourse more universal, because no specific culture or language can claim, proprietorial ownership of that particular perspective. Science is science. It doesn't really matter whether a Westerner does it or Easterner does it, or whether you are a Christian or a Buddhist. Science is science. And that's why science is a very powerful force in helping us make the language and understanding of something like compassion much more universal and natural language. So all of this is, and of course, on top of that, everybody in this room are familiar with what some journalists refer to as mindfulness revolution. Over the last few decades, there have been a tremendous profusion of not just the spread of mindfulness as a practice, but also tremendous amount of research that has come out. So it is in this kind of time we need to understand the emergence of the programs that are being represented in this next few days in this conference. So let me so I want to sort of bring your attention to the specific compassion training programs that have emerged, and I'm going to list mainly the best known ones which have been studied. So first one I chose because I'm the one who was partly involved in this, so for transparency. Second is cognitively, so this is not a question of any hierarchy, okay, I'm just listing them. Cognitively based compassion training from Emory, compassion-focused therapy, and compassionate mind training. Both of these are, Paul Gilbert was the key kind of developer of these. And I think CFT is going to be represented in our meeting here. Sustainable compassion training, which is not being represented in this particular meeting, but this is John Markansky and Brooke Dawson-Lavalle's program. I don't think there's been any scientific studies done on this so far. Mindful self-compassion, of course, it's a big player in this field. We have a good representation in this conference. And mindful-based compassionate living is also represented. So, and then there is a GRACE, and GRACE is an sort of an acronym standing for gratitude, respect, acceptance, compassion, and empathy, which is Roshi John Halifax's program, which has been used quite extensively at Johns Hopkins Medical School for special focused on training clinicians. So these are the best known compassion trainings, and I have not listed any of the adaptations that are for specific populations. So these are more generic programs that I've listed here. The first CCT, CBT, and to an extent CFT as well as CST, these have been quite extensively influenced by Tibetan tradition. And mindful self-compassion, the main authors are here, they will speak, but I think the Buddhist influence came primarily from the Theravada tradition rather than the Tibetan. And mindfulness-based compassionate living is a kind of a compassion training program developed specifically for clinicians who have taken MBCT, that's my understanding, mindfulness-based cognitive behavior therapy. So I think it's important to understand the emergence of these in the larger context that I spoke about earlier, where they have a lot of background information that has gone before, and which helps why there are these kind of things happening. And when science and the general discourse on compassion, as well as these secularized protocols, emergence come together, then we have a mix that really help push the field further. So it's not just one player. There are the scientists, the researchers, there are the programs, and so on. So I spoke about the mindfulness revolution, and you can see the contrast. On the left, this is Jane Chan, one of Compassion Institute staff. I asked her help to do a kind of a quick PubMed research. So she helped me find this. So on the left is the publications. These are all scientific academic publications. On the left, from 1999 to 2018, it's a mindfulness, and the scale is from 0 to 1,000 or 1,200. So it's just below 1,000 annual publications. So you can imagine how the mindfulness, scientific publications have grown. And if you look at the big turning point, it's really 2006. That's when Ritchie's paper on that particular, business organization was published. John Kabat-Zinn's work. On the right, a similar kind of time frame for compassion research, and this is the scale is much smaller. This is below 100. So, but on the other hand, the trend is unmistakable. You can see, and it's somewhere around 2008-09. That's when many of the programs I was talking about started emerging and becoming more known. And now you can see this big jump in scientific publications that is happening now. So although it's nowhere near the scale of mindfulness, but the trend is there. And Peter talked about, in his opening remarks, that everybody seems to be talking about compassion training. What's going on here? So you can see how in the scientific research, changes are taking place. This is an interesting one, and this is it's a combination of mindfulness and compassion, and this is more than the publication just on compassion science, compassion practice training research. So my hunch is these are scientific studies that probably compare the two, and maybe also mindfulness self-compassion research, which has a huge amount of research, probably is what is pumping this up. So that, that's encouraging. Is it time to celebrate? I don't think so. But I think it is encouraging, and the scientific research community is really catching on. Now, all of these, this is specifically on compassion training, and I'm going to use the word compassion training in a generic sense, so not aligned to any particular program. And this recently in the handbook of, I know that the research will be covered also in the final day. Christine is going to talk about research and compassion, but I wanted to just give you a kind of a snapshot of what are the major findings, because recently in that Oxford handbook, there was a paper that did a really good meta-survey of all the studies and presented in a nice kind of easy, plain English. I'm myself not a scientist, so when I have to look at charts and try to scratch my head and try to see the number, it's very confusing. But they did a fantastic job on summarizing, so I thought it would be helpful just to get a sense. So this is from the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science. So what they found, and these are effects that they've looked on, the changes on the effect, which is the emotion, changes on people's natural reaction to the perception of suffering, and also stress and inflammation. So these are many different kind of things that they have looked at. So these are from the published findings: decreased and self-report worry, emotional suppression decreased, and this is an important finding because it turns out one of the contributing factors for burnout is really using suppression as a mechanism for dealing with emotion. And on a long-term basis, that using suppression as a way of dealing with emotions is not really healthy, it's not constructive. So compassion training seems to help decrease that kind of basic kind of strategy that people adopt. Markers of stress and inflammation that came primarily from the Emory research program. Decrease of aversive responses, because many people, when they are confronted with suffering, they sort of they want to just don't deal with it because it's too distressful. And those who have the experience of parenting kids, you will see in your children that there seems to be a slightly dispositional difference. Some children immediately rush. When the mother is crying, or I remember at my home once my wife was clipping the nail of our dog, and she over-clipped and cut a little bit, and the dog bit her, and she cried. And we have two small kids, and it was quite fascinating to see the natural response, how different it was between the two children. One responds to aversive, can't deal with the distress. The other reaches out immediately and hugs her mom. So you can see there's a dispositional difference. But the point I'm trying to make is that we are emotional creatures. When we are confronted with a difficult situation or a pain or suffering, we will naturally react. And we may react in the form of a personal distress and avoid it, or we may react in a compassionate way and reach out and help. And that is no judgment on the personality. It's a kind of a habit or mechanism or maybe dispositional difference up to a point. So that's what there seem to be decrease in that kind of aversive response to witnessing suffering. What increased was compassion for self and others, mindfulness and happiness, environmental mastery and personal growth facets of well-being. This is a particular conception of well-being within which these these facets were increasing. Responsiveness to signals of suffering in others. So, instead of being apathetic or instead of not caring, there seems to be an increase in being more responsive. And empathic accuracy, that I think is important, especially for clinicians or people who are working in the healthcare setting, and also teachers who are teaching very small children. The empathic accuracy is very crucial because sometimes you misunderstand, and then instead of helping, you might punish the kid. So empathic accuracy, the scope of individuals toward whom one may experience compassion. So the ability to kind of expand. It's like expanding the circle of concern. And altruistic action to relieve witnessed inequity. So this came through some kind of study of economic games and how you respond to people who cheat, and there's injustice that goes on. And incidents of helping behavior in real-world situations. This is a study that gave some 20-minute compassion training, and then they would put them in a situation like in a subway to see whether they were more likely to give their seats to someone who's struggling, or so those kind of helping behavior in real world situations. So I think although it's very early days, because more studies need to be done, and many of the studies use self-report, but increasingly, more and more sophisticated studies will emerge, including kind of studies that would look at the mechanisms of how these changes are happening. And so these things will come. But for those of us who are actually at the end of program development, I'm not on the scientific camp. I do talk a little bit about science not because I was trained as a scientist, but because of my role in Mind and Life for over 30 years. I've been forced to speak scientific language because of His Holiness's long-term interest. And in order to interpret for him, I have to sort of get up to speed. But my main camp is really on the program, the training side. And on the training side, those of us, Gisela and myself, who come from the Tibetan tradition, we come from a tradition that has quite a sophisticated psychology as well, in addition to meditation practice. So we have our own theory of why compassion training matters and what is happening, and why would we expect some kind of change in the behavior. Because in the end, what you would want is the change in the level of behavior. Because if there's no change at the level of behavior, then its impact is really negligible. It's one thing to be yourself, be more peaceful, fair enough, it's a really good thing. But when it comes to compassion, it is a pro-social quality. And pro-sociality has to do with your relationship with someone, a relationship with another person. So we are interested ultimately in a changed behavior, a way of being in the world, way of relating to others, and way of treating others. So we have a kind of a basic theory, because we don't naively get into this program and believe in some kind of magic, because it's been done thousands of years. If we just get the right formula, something will work, and let's try it out. It's not really that simple. I think that there is underlying theory of change, and this theory of change, I would argue, is actually quite similar to what psychologists would assume as well when it comes to program like compassion training. So what the theory of change suggests is that we need to, if we're going to make some changes, if we're going to bring about some transformation, we need to look at many different places. One is at the level of perception, the way in which you see yourself, the way in which you see the world, the way in which you see the other person in front of you. That's a perception. And that perception will also give you an outlook on the world. So in other words, what's your philosophy of life? And that is one area. There's some technique and transformation and practices work at that level. And the idea is that that will have an impact on your attitudes and the values that you're going to bring into the world. There was a time when scientists would think that we start our life with a clean slate, blank slate. We now know that human beings, by the time they start speaking, they have already formed a certain kind of idea of the world. And it turns out pre-verbal kids already have some idea. And, so our attitudes, our perception is going to affect our attitudes and values. And together, they affect the way we actually feel about the world. The different perceptions people have of one and the same environment, one and the same world. The two different people can experience the world in a different way. And we know that from our personal experience. If we're living in the same neighborhood, if one type of family whose primary mode of perception in that environment is that of fear, we should be worried about, don't talk to strangers, they are out to get you, we need to make sure that doors are always locked. Or you have another family which is much more relaxed, you give people benefit of the doubt, believe that most people really will act from a first instance, from a good place. These two, families are going to experience their neighborhood completely differently. They're living in exactly the same place, same environment. They may have socioeconomic kind of status in a fairly similar, but because they have a different perception of the world, different attitude to the world that they bring, they experience the world differently. And this is real at the emotional level. And when we experience the world in a particular way, we behave from that place. And if we have learned one thing from conversations between Buddhism and contemporary psychology, is that the important role emotion plays in motivating human behavior. There was a time in Western psychology where, when it came to, psychology of human behavior, rational choice theory was very important, because there was the belief that ultimately everybody is motivated by the pursuit of self-interest. So, human beings are profit maximizers and so on and so forth. But now, because of the revolution in emotion research, people know that what the most powerful motivating factors are really emotions. And we may come up with a rational explanation afterwards. Why did you do that? He was unjust to me, X, Y, and Z. I don't like him. But that is a secondary, after the fact, rational explanation. But what made you act was really coming from a place of emotion. And so emotion is what changes our behavior. And the repeated engagement in that behavior will form a habit. And that habit is going to have a loop-back effect on your perception. So there's a kind of a basic theory. And I would argue it's basically broadly similar in contemporary psychology as well, if you look at any theory of change behind a program like this. So compassion training really works at these many different levels, and it's not just one directional. It's also, the other way around as well. We know, for example, those who have brought children, we know that if children are, instead of being told, oh, it's good to be kind to others, it's nice to share, if they're given an opportunity to share, they enjoy the experience and they will do it. So sometimes doing is what actually promotes the pro-social kind of emotions. It's not always from the mind to the action. It is sometimes the action itself, which then forms a habit and then kicks in. So I think the causal, arrow should also go the other way around as well. The relationship is much more complicated. But the point I'm trying to make is that, the training, the many of the trainings that you will hear about really has broadly, not necessarily exactly this kind of language I'm using, but that's my language, But since this is the kind of the opening talk, I'm supposed to be speaking more in this general shared language. So that's the broad, theory of change, and it makes kind of logical sense. So in this kind of thing, where if you look at any program, particularly those that are to do with compassion, mindfulness is a different kind of program. The compassion training is a different kind of program, and I will get to that later, the distinction. So motivation and aspiration is one domain where kind of we work. Affect generation and modulation. So affect is emotion. It's a scientific term for emotion. Evocation of specific feelings and then modulating that is another type of domain. And then, at the level of perspective, shifting your perspective and identifying with the other person in front of you. For example, if you're struggling with a difficult person, unless you're able to find some connection with that person, you're going to always struggle. So this is the kind of, these are the key domains. And then the techniques that are used in these kind of domains are in compassion training. When it comes to motivation, you work at your conscious intention. So you have intention setting practices. You have self-directed suggestions, which today I'm going to work hard at not getting worked up by small incidents. So those kind of self-directed suggestions. And then verbal aspirations is where you use phrases. The 4 immeasurables, Buddhist prayer is a form of verbal aspirations. So these are really all working at the level of motivation and aspiration, because emotions cannot be changed directly. They are much harder because emotions are immediate, they are spontaneous, but you can change the emotion by changing your intention and perception. Then you change the way you feel about things. In the affect modulation, we use visualization of certain scenarios, such as loving kindness and also loving kindness and compassion wishing phrases. So many of you are familiar, may you be happy, may you be free from pain, and so on. So these are wishing phrases that are part of the meditation practice and which are really there to prime you to feel in a particular way. It's really an evocation of a certain affect states. Then in our program, we also use this, increasingly most compassion training programs are using dietic exercises which involve 2 people, sitting opposite each other and going through an exercise, which is an attempt to evoke certain types of, feelings in a real life context rather than using just a scenario and visualization. Because visualization requires someone closing their eyes and imagining those scenario alone, quietly sitting. But some of these are probably more effectively done through real interaction, empathetic listening and someone sharing their experiences and so on. You can evoke these things. And then one of the important things is bringing awareness to real life experience. So those are really all important part of affect generation kind of domain practice. And in the final part, in the perspective shift, is a cognitive reframing. If you had a difficult situation, how do you interpret that? You can ask yourself, if you reacted out of judgment through habit, then you can remember that situation and ask yourself, how could have I reacted to that, responded to that situation from a more compassionate standpoint? So you reframe this situation. But initially, it's going to be very difficult to bring this right on when the challenge is there, because that kind of spontaneity requires a fair bit of practice. But all of us who are committed to doing something like this can always remind ourselves, okay, and instead of beating yourself, you find a time to say, okay, let me replay that. How did I react? Could I have done a better job? What would the scenario would have been like if I had used compassion as a way of responding? So that's the cognitive reframing, and also taking the perspective of other person. So that's a kind of a perspective taking. Appreciation of others is a very important part of compassion training, because you have to make the connection with another person. And so the interdependence is used often in this understanding how, even the jacket that I'm wearing. Imagine if I want to, there's this life history. What was it called? Life history cycle. There was this idea that if you can take something like an iPhone, and then if you trace, what involved in making something like that, you'll be surprised to see how many people may have been involved, and how many continents may have been involved in making that small piece of device brought in your hand. So this is kind of appreciating others, and common humanity practice is a very important part of compassion, any compassion training, because you want to really reach at that fundamental human shared reality. And the main practice that is used there is the phrase, just like me. He doesn't want to be in difficulties. So just like me is a powerful phrase. Reminds me of a little anecdote. In fact, CCT was taught for 2 years at PTSD residential treatment center for the vets in Palo Alto. And one of the things that really kind of inspired me was the story of one of the participants who later was asked what he learned from this. He said, well, all this meditation thing, I'm not quite sure. It's just kind of tough and sitting quietly. That's not kind of my cup of tea. He said, I didn't get much. But one thing that I found very helpful is this mantra. What mantra? We have no mantra. He was talking about just like me. He said, I used to get so worked up when I see someone being unfair. So for example, in a grocery store, if someone jumps the line, he really used to get mad, or someone cuts him and takes over the parking space. He used to get mad, and he had real anger issues. And he said the thing that helped him most was the just like me mantra, because whenever he was getting worked up, he would say to remind himself, just like me. And he said it really calmed him down. So this is, it was not meant to be a mantra, but if he's going to use it as a mantra, so be it. So I think those are basic, and I would assume that these kind of basic ideas are there in all the compassion training. So one thing that I wanted to share to this community particularly is, since many of us in this room are really involved in the development of program, one thing that I would like to appeal to all of you, including myself included, that we learn from others. And if we look at intervention, I think it's helpful to think of what types of intervention there are out there. And here, I think looking at the scientists who are researching this, because one thing about scientists is that for scientists to measure something, they need to first have a broad operational definition. They need to categorize. So they need to, because if they're going to measure something, they need to say what they're measuring or what they're studying, and which really forces them to come up with categorization, which we on the camp of developers or program may not actually think about. So I think here I find it helpful. So this is a material that I picked up from that Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, and this is Wise and Zaki. They're really talking not so much about explicitly compassion, but they're talking about empathy interventions. And the distinction was made between what they call empathy inducing, which they found out that most programs on empathy are really there to help people bolster their empathy to a particular group or if they're struggling. But they also identified there's another type of program which is not that well known, but increasingly it's emerging, which is not so much bolstering the empathic ability itself, but working at the level of motivation. Teaching people to be more motivated to empathize. So that distinction between motive-based and the actual inducing is an interesting distinction, and I think it would be helpful to take a look at this and see which aspects of our own program, is the first type or the second type. Similarly, one important distinction they made was what they call experience-based and expression-based. And this, I think, is an interesting distinction. It's a much broader distinction. And there, of course, some programs will have both elements, but generally programs tend to emphasize one or the other. Experience-based interventions, feature some technique to tune into the target's, mental state. So a lot of the experiential, programs, and many of the meditation-based programs probably will fall into that category. But the intervention that they are studying are, mostly non-meditation-based. They involve, taking the role or role-playing or those kind of things, which are really, interventions that involve processes that will allow you to feel like what it is to be that member of that particular group. Expression-based seems to emphasize more the language and the communication. And so for many of the clinical hospital programs seems to really emphasize the latter. How you communicate to your patient, how to, adopt a certain facial posture, how to actually express your empathy. So a lot of this is really based on, expression and communication. And I think, it would be good for many of us who are doing the program to, again, take a look at this kind of distinction and look at our own program and say, okay, which aspects of the program is more experience-based and which aspects of our program are more expression-based. Now, I'm not going to read that. That's basically a distinction. And now, one of the things that I would really like to impress on the key players in this room is to really resist the temptation, either consciously or subconsciously, it may be there, to somehow reduce the meaning of compassion training or compassion intervention to really meditation and Buddhist-derived programs. In our community particularly, we could fall victim to that. And this is an important point I want to make because compassion is way bigger than Buddhist-derived programs. Compassion is way bigger than contemplative practice-based compassion programs. Compassion is, as I said right at the beginning, is a universal value. And there are already interventions that have nothing to do with perspectives that are informed by Buddhism. So I think it is an important point to remember that as we think about compassion training, as we think about compassion-based intervention, that we don't rule all of those out. We need to find a way to, and hopefully maybe the next Compassion and Connection conference could actually make the umbrella even bigger and invite those folks in. And I just wanted to give one example from a medical, intervention, medical place-based intervention. And this is from biomedical care medical publication. And I happened to bump into this because recently I was invited to be on the closing panel of the World Congress on Palliative Care, which took place in Montreal. And part of that preparation, although I was on a panel, but I did prepare a little bit so that I'm not completely ignorant of the community that I'm speaking to. And I've bumped into some of this very interesting research that is going on in the palliative care world. And it makes perfect sense, because palliative care is one healthcare context where care is, if not more, equally important to cure. In fact, the emphasis should be more on the caring than curing, whereas in the normal hospital setting, much more emphasis is really on the healing and the cure. So in palliative care, because the emphasis is really on caring, compassion becomes front and center. How do you treat? How do you make the patients, comfortable in all of this? And there was an interesting study that was done, and what struck me was the way in which compassion intervention was being brought into this context, which is quite different from the way in which we are bringing, our programs are very generic. This is for a very particular community. And what they were teaching was they identified 3 essential skills for the doctors: building a relationship with the patient, understanding the patient as a person, so that means seeing the person behind the disease, and then emotional resonance, which is empathy. So those are the 3 essential skills they were trying to teach. And the training methods, it's interesting. The 3 main training methods they were using, one is person-centered communication skills, really kind of the language is really about the person. Second is reflective practice. This is one domain where some practices do seem like meditation, but not quite. But it involves journaling and that sort of thing. And third is compassion role modeling. So really basically walking the talk and yourself being the role model. So you can see that this is actually an interesting way of thinking about interventions within a specific population. So those of us who have aspirations to move into a special population, to adapt our program, I think we need to really learn from what has been done before so that we don't walk into this setting, thinking that we know everything. So I think that I just wanted to bring that up. Now, definition of compassion, one good thing about definition of compassion is that there is broadly a consensus, so hardly any dispute. Compassion, this is from an influential paper, meta review on the research on compassion. So compassion is the feeling that arises in witnessing another's suffering and that motivates a subsequent desire to help. So you can see there's an empathetic connection and concern, and then some kind of wish to help. Whereas empathy is the vicarious experience of another's emotion. So the distinction is made. So this is now broadly accepted in the scientific community as a definition of compassion and empathy. The key components are, I'm sorry that the text are a little small, so on the back probably you can't see it, but so key components are, one, an awareness of the suffering in others, which is more of a cognitive and empathy. As a concern related to being, emotionally moved by the suffering, which is more of an emotional response, and then wish to see the situation, that change, the relief of that suffering, and often accompanied by a readiness to want to do something. So this is a very broadly how compassion is defined, and we can see that there is not that much difference between the way in which in science it is being defined now versus how it is being defined in the programs. So I think I'm going to skip this because what I thought was there are certain insights in science that are coming which we on the program side need to take a look at. I'm going to skip this because we have Kristen who's going to speak on the scientific side on the final day, and more of this will come in our panel discussions. What I want to do is to now look at, from the Buddhist perspectives, some of us who are in this program, our own personal practice is grounded in Buddhism, but when we are in this secular domain of developing compassion and bringing it to the larger world, it is very important that we don't feel that we need to have allegiance to Buddhism. I think this is an important distinction we need to make so that what we are bringing into the world is truly universal and universalizable. And here, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, when CK group went to see him and proposed to him the establishment of CK, His Holiness was very happy, and he gave a major donation as a seed money. And then he gave 2 advice. He said, whatever science you do needs to be really first class, impeccable, and rigorous. Second, any education programs that you're going to develop should be really universal and universalizable. He said, no backdoor Buddhism. He was really clear. And I think it is important. But at the same time, I don't think we should shy away from tapping into the insights and resources that are there in Buddhism. Because This is one tradition that has thought about this, that has taken this practice very seriously, that has actually developed techniques and tools for enhancing personal experience of compassion and perception of others from a compassionate standpoint. So I think it's important to really tap deeper into the Buddhist resources with a clear-eyed view that it needs to be adapted and naturalized in a language that is accessible and universal. So there is, for example, this whole connection between perception, attitude, feelings, and behavior, which is such a fundamental principle of Buddhist psychology. I think there's a lot more one can learn from this. Secondly, many of us who come from the Buddhist tradition, when we bring compassion teachings to the world, we bring 4 immeasurables. But as of now, I don't see that people who are even bringing the program are really fully cognizant of the relationship between compassion to the other immeasurables. It's not fleshed out. So we may have, we tend to leave it at the level of aspiration, and we tend to focus on compassion. But in the traditional context, compassion is never taught alone on its own. It's either part of the 4 immeasurables, or compassion is taught as a means to generating bodhicitta. So are we missing something here by taking just compassion out and not looking at the relationship between the other immeasurables? Are these immeasurables sequential? Do we need to work from loving kindness to compassion to joy and sympathy? Well, Buddha Ghosha seems to suggest that, at least at the initial stage. But at this point, we don't really know. And I think it's something that's worth tapping into, especially those of us, our program that is inspired from the Buddhist perspective. One could argue that loving kindness is the preparation because it is changing the way we feel about someone. Compassion is then kicks in because we now care and want to help the other person. Joy has more to do with dealing with obstacles like jealousy, envy, which really comes in the way of, truly expressing your compassion. So you need to take care of that by cultivating explicitly sympathetic joy. And equanimity seems to be more of a question of ability to give you the stability and firmness so that your compassion is not easily pushed around by situations or your own emotional state of mind. That's one way of looking at it, but that's my take. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot more one needs to learn from this. In the Indo-Tibetan tradition, there is a suggestion that compassion may start initially from the very concrete, personal, because we are moved by a real suffering in front of us, a person. And if we depersonalize it, it kills our compassion. So we know that. There's a reason why charitable organizations, when they want to raise money, they show, very moving faces of real people, real kids, real children. So at the beginning, most of our compassion is contingent upon a concrete person in need or pain in front of us. But the tradition suggests that as you advance, compassion can arise where there is less and less dependent on this concrete perception of suffering in front of you, even to the point where the text talks about non-referential compassion, where compassion just naturally arises without having to go through this empathetic route, which involves having an emotional resonance. Can we learn something from this? Is that what someone like the Dalai Lama displays when His Holiness, he's able to call on compassion response like that, without actually there needing to be a painful situation in front of you. Another thing that is a huge question is the relationship between compassion and wisdom. This is one very important question in the Buddhist tradition, but in the secular world, we do need to address this. We may not call it wisdom. We may call it something else, insight. But sometimes you need, intention alone doesn't get you there. You may feel compassion, but how you express that, how you act on it, requires some kind of wisdom in order for it to be really effective. So the relationship between wisdom and compassion, again, is an important discussion in the Buddhist tradition. What can we learn from this discussion in the secular training program? So these are something that I want to just throw out there for those of us, because in this room are many people who are really interested in deepening their own programs and thinking more widely. So before I end, I wanted to just touch this question of the distinction between mindfulness-based interventions and compassion-based interventions, because the chances are, from the larger media point of view, because many of these are informed by Buddhist kind of practices and Buddhist perspectives, we're going to be lumped together into one big camp, and everything is called mindfulness something. So I think it is important to know there are two different types of practice. They are complementary, but actually the approach is different. So in mindfulness, typically in the contemporary mindfulness, it involves adopting a neutral observer standpoint vis-a-vis your experiences. In terms of feeling tone, it's neutral. There is no judgment. That's an important attitude that you have to adopt. It's present-centered, really is the heart of the contemporary mindfulness practice. It's intrapersonal. It's really more about your own experience and looking into your, whether it is psychosomatic, physical, or whatever, sensory. And there is no working at the level of your intention. You may start your practice with an intention, but in the actual sitting itself, intention has very little role in terms of modulation. And in itself, it's kind of value neutral. It's independent of ethics. And this is why there's a lot of debate right now going on the contemporary mindfulness. But just because it is independent of ethics doesn't mean it's a wrong, bad thing. Clearly, repeated studies show that this type of practice is powerful. It has huge benefits. But in itself, from a moral point of view, it's neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. So it's morally kind of neutral. But if you compare that to compassion training involves appraisal of your feelings and thoughts. It's a much more engaged practice, active. It involves evoking effects through empathy, inducing imagery. It involves practices that involve, invoking scenarios of past and future. So present-centeredness is not an important part of it. In addition to intrapersonal, which is kind of self-compassion type, but also it has interpersonal because it's a relationship. But you could also say it has transpersonal because it's this kind of big picture kind of idea. And then intention is a very important part of compassion because in practice you bring compassion. And because compassion is so closely connected with ethics, ethics is front and center. If you're bringing compassion into a particular context, you can't avoid ethics. So its value is really important part of it. And in some ways, it makes it more challenging to bring to a secular environment. Whereas mindfulness, because of its value-neutral status, it's easier to bring because you can use the language of skills, efficiency, focus, and so on. Whereas when you're bringing compassion, you're kind of changing the culture. So, there's no two ways about, the value question and when you're bringing compassion. So it's important to know that they are, and in an ideal world, you would want a program that combines both. So you would have both the skills that involve adoption of neutral standpoint, no judgment, present-centered, interpersonal, and so on. A lot of these involve also, sort of focusing on your mind and being able to observe, not react, and so on. But also, you would want something that brings this more messiness of human nature into your own spiritual practice as well. So I think it's really helpful to be clear about this. And right now, there's a lot of debate going on mindfulness and its relation to ethics. I was asked to contribute a paper to a journal on current opinion in psychology. It's going to bring out a special volume on mindfulness, and which is looking also at the question of relationship with ethics. So I wanted to, I'm not going to read this, so I would like to end with this, which is all the programs that I've spoken about so far are really a bottom-up approach, which is really working at the level of individual. So we may teach in a group setting, but essentially the approach is really from the individual. But if we are serious about bringing compassion to the world, we also need to find a way to bring it a top-down approach. And this is a very important point for those of us who has aspirations to moving into a specific settings like healthcare or education or leadership or whatever, or corporate setting. I think there, to bring compassion only through the bottom-up approach, by teaching the individual members of that community alone is not going to be sufficient. You really need the top-down approach, so that a beauty of the top-down approach is it really creates a shared culture, shared language, and shared norms, which also establishes a certain expectation for people to behave in a particular way. Right now, thanks to Me Too movement, our antennas are much higher, there's a much greater self-awareness, and people are struggling. How can we change the culture? Changing the culture really requires changing institutional structures. And this is one important insight that social science has taught us. If we really want to make a real change, we have to change the institutions. Because when you change the institutions, everybody who's a member of that community benefits. But if you work only bottom-up approach, then there's a kind of a self-selection process. And those who have a certain disposition will benefit, will take it, but it will not have much impact on the larger, itself. Now, I put a question mark because I haven't got a clue how to do this. I know this needs to be done, that I know, but as for how this needs to be done, I just don't have a clue. So that's why I think it's something that all of us really need to think. And here we will probably need to, not probably, actually we will need to seek the expertise and advice from people who are really outside our community, people who have expertise on understanding systems and processes and so on. And here I have this beautiful quote from His Holiness, which I think really makes that point. Love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. So with that, I'm going to stop and